All right. Well, after this is a little ambiguous because if you remember last week, the story actually took us down years into the future, And so it's clearly not after that, which took us clear down to the birth of Solomon and so on. So then it becomes a matter, what is the this that is being referred to here? And as I say, commentators tend to agree that it's actually referring to the this related to David and Bathsheba, the death of Uriah, the marriage of David and Bathsheba. So some months after that, but before Nathan appears in the story. We hear of Absalom. Haven't seen much or heard much from him yet. His name has been mentioned a couple of times, that's all. He is the son of a princess that David married when he was back in Hebron. So this is a foreign princess from a place called Geshur, and it's a marriage treaty that was entered between these two. So Absalom is half Israelite, you might say, but half Geshurite. And so he has that particular parental situation. Tamar is his younger sister, considerably younger, presumably. Absalom was born when David was in Hebron. Tamar was born probably some years later, and the best guess is she's probably in her mid-teens. So she may be a young woman of 15, 16 years old. That seems to make the most sense in the story. Her name means palm tree, by the way. And both she and her older brother Absalom were quite noted for their good looks. And we hear reference to that more than once in the biblical account. Amnon is David's oldest son. He was born of a woman whose name is Ahinoam, about which we know virtually nothing, except that she was the earliest wife after Michal, the daughter of Saul. Remember, Michal was given to someone else. David married Ahinoam. We're not sure if it was quite before or after his marriage to Abigail, but probably a little before. The biblical account doesn't tell us definitively. And so the firstborn son to David is Amnon. This is the one who, all things being equal, would eventually be the king. And that's an important little factor in the way the story plays out. He has a fair amount of prestige in the family precisely because many people regard him as the future king. And so he gets away with some things that others might not. It's probable, although we don't have any biblical warrant for this, that in the extended family dynamics that surround the palace and the king and all of the family get-togethers, that sort of thing, that there had probably been, on the part of Amnon, who's about 10 years older than Tamar, a little what we might call innocent flirtation. You know how it is. Cousins sometimes do that. That's kind of the way this was viewed. Half-siblings, sometimes viewed as family, but extended family, and so we can imagine that there was a little bit of history to this, and it may very well be that Tamar herself was somewhat flattered at getting attentions from someone who had this likely, career expectation of being the next king. And so if you can just kind of imagine this, I don't think it takes much imagination for us to sort of figure out that there may have been something of this going on. I am on purely speculative grounds here, you understand that. But you just kind of read into the story a little bit just to kind of make sense of it. And at least it seems that something of that probably is at least informing the overall drama. Well, Amnon, for whatever reason, let this innocent flirtation, if there was such a thing, become a little bit more obsessive than it should have been, became so distressed that he became sick. She was a virgin, and the point of that is to say she was kept under very tight control. So here he is, with no convenient way, really, to get next to her, certainly no way to be alone with her. Virgin daughters of a king, both in Israel and elsewhere, were kept under chaperone supervision all the time. There was no secrets, you see, with a person in this particular situation. And so he didn't have any convenient way to sort of get next to her or to take a little walk in the park, anything like that. It just wasn't going to happen. And so it put him in this situation of being rather obsessed with her, apparently, and yet could not do anything to her. The sense of the word is couldn't do anything toward her or with her. he couldn't even really disclose any further interest that he might have had in her. And of course, the whole problem of forbidden fruit just takes on a whole new kind of meaning in a situation like this. Well, as it turns out, Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. It happens to be his cousin, Amnon's cousin, David's nephew. It's the son of one of David's brothers. He is said to be crafty. The word sounds worse than it is, but it's a word that means to be subtle or shrewd. Smart, street smart is we might put it in the vernacular. It's not always used in a bad sense. Sometimes it just means somebody that can kind of read life. A good political advisor would have the kind of giftedness that this one had. He was probably a little too smart on this occasion. I'm sure he regretted the advice he gave to Amnon before it was done. I don't think he had any idea it was going to play out like this. He was just trying to cook up a little scheme so that the two could have a little time together, for whatever. And he was going to leave it at that, kind of under the rubric of general, innocent, whatever, not expecting much more to happen. His later behavior suggests that he himself was appalled at the brutish behavior of Amnon before this whole thing was over. Jonadab reveals his possession for the family talent of handling people. He was David's nephew and a sycophant par excellence. Without Jonadab, Amnon's frustration would only have poisoned himself. Now it poisons the family. What havoc is created by the smart, conscienceless people in the world. Part of youth's training should include warning against clever friends who can plot how to get illegal things legally, but who rarely see the ultimate consequences of their advice. I think probably by the time Jonadab was 40 or 50 years old, he could still read the tea leaves pretty well, but I bet he gave a little bit more rational counsel, when it was his turn to offer such. In this case, of course, it led to a complete catastrophe. Well, anyway, his plan was this. Why are you, the king's son, becoming thinner every day? Why don't you tell me? And Amnon explains it's his fixation on Tamar. Literally, why are you so lean? Is the Hebrew there. Jonadab said to him, well, look, try this. Lie down on your bed, pretend to be ill. When your father comes to see you, say, please let my sister Tamar come and give me some food. Prepare it for me. Serve me here, and I'll feel better. A royal son, especially the heir to the throne, would have had considerably more independence. He probably lived in a separate dwelling, maybe a little kind of 3-bedroom apartment, that sort of thing. And certainly he could come and go much more freely than could Tamar, the virgin daughter. If he pretends to be ill, it's certainly predictable that his father, David, would drop by, see what's going on, check on his son. It's likely that Tamar had a reputation for kitchen skills. This was considered a desirable thing even for a royal daughter. And so it may not be as outlandish as it seems to us at first for Amnon to say, well, send Tamar over so she can make some of those great little pancakes. I mean, those things just always make you feel better, and so it's almost like the medicinal effect of this, and David isn't able to kind of spot what's going on here. And so that seems to be at least likely what's going on. Candy and I lately have been watching the Great British Baking Show. I always thought you just put the mix in the thing, put it in the oven, now it comes a cake. I didn't know it's an amazing skill, an amazing science that goes into baking these elaborate concoctions these people come up with. And I think she was kind of in that class. I think she had probably would have done fine if she'd been in that competition. So we're going to assume that as well, just kind of bring that to the table, because I think that may be part of why this happened quite the way it did. Well, Amnon thought that was a good idea. He lay down, pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, please let my sister Tamar come and make me a couple of those delicious cakes she makes so that she can serve me here. Then David sent home to Tamar saying, go to your brother Amnon's house, prepare food for him. So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house where he was lying down. She took dough, kneaded it, made cakes in his sight, baked the cakes. Took a little while. Probably very proud of her skills in doing this, you know. Probably flattered that he had asked that she would come and do this in service of the man that may be the next king in Israel. She took the pans, set them out before him, but he refused to eat. Amnon said, "Send everybody out." So everybody went out from him. So it was unusual, but we're assuming she had this kind of reputation for her abilities in the kitchen. We don't know exactly what she made. The text doesn't really suggest, but I'm going to suggest to you some kind of little delicacy, you know. And then he asked everyone to leave. Now, she probably should have had a little alarm bells going on at this point. But hey, he's in his mid-20s, 26, 27. He has a high degree of prestige in the family. She's just a teenager. She's a royal teenager, but still there's an age difference, a kind of perceived authority difference. And so while she might have had alarm bells, she probably wasn't prepared to overrule them. Certainly not to just leave in a huff or something like that. Didn't quite see what was coming. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the bedroom that I may eat it from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes that she had made and brought them to Amnon, her brother, in the bedroom. Now when she had brought them to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come lie with me, my sister." But she answered, "No, my brother, don't force me. No such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing." All right. There's probably more going on here than just this immediate request, but you can imagine he's calculated this. He may not quite have planned to do this, but now he's alone with her. They're in the bedroom. You know, I'm not going to make this an R-rated Sunday school lesson, but I think your imaginations can probably figure out he's using every solicitous kind of appeal to her. Hey, it's not a big deal. Come on, you know, no one's going to know. Come on, just, you know, and he's kind of appealing to her in that sort of way. And she, of course, to her credit, is resisting, as rightly she should. Don't force me, and the texture of the word force me is don't humble me. It's not force as in physical violent force. I don't think she saw that coming yet, but more just don't put me in this position of forcing me to lose, you know, my reputation, sort of that idea. Don't do this disgraceful thing. She's trying to respond as if there's an element of reason in this guy, and maybe she can reach it, you know. A little naive on her part. She doesn't realize what a you know, brute he's going to turn out to be, and so at this point she's still trying to get out of this. Saving face for him and maybe for herself as well. She's trying every argument she can think of. Where would I take my shame? As for you, you'd be like one of the fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He wouldn't withhold me from you. Where would I take my shame? A loss of purity under these circumstances, of course, would be a lifelong stigma, as indeed it turned out to be. And so she is fearing for her whole situation as a royal virgin daughter of the king as to what the consequences would be if this thing played out the way he's trying to persuade her. You would be as one of the fools. This is not the normal word for fool. It's a word that is attached to someone who is a fool because they are undisciplined, unchaste, unable to manage their own passions, their own impulses, and so they're viewed as kind of a victim of their own inner lusts. So that's the sense of the word, and she's saying that's what you're going to be regarded at if you keep pushing this point. And then she says this very interesting thing, he would not withhold me from you. Now there's been a lot of debate among commentators. Was she being sincere at this point? It's possible. It's possible that she's thinking this wouldn't be all bad to turn out to be the queen, you know. And so at this point, we don't know. We can't read her mind. One commentator said Tamar was probably trying to gain time by this plea. But if not, it was a sad commentary on the level of morals in the family. David had lost the moral high ground. And in that atmosphere, it appeared that, as Cole Porter put it, anything goes. This is why the old advice, do what I say, not what I do, rarely has much effect. I'm going to soften up that comment slightly, because actually, in the ancient Near Eastern world, not in Israel, but not far from it, marriage to half-sisters was not considered an illegitimate or immoral thing. Abraham, the patriarch, was married to his half-sister. You know that, Sarah. And so that kind of thing, we of course recoil from that, and for good reason. But at that particular time in history, that wasn't necessarily viewed as a facially just abhorrent thing. You can't imagine anything worse. Nothing like that. It wasn't viewed as incestuous, for example. And so we don't know what's in her mind. We certainly know she wasn't wanting what actually happened here, but whether she was actually trying to, get some advantage out of this herself, who knows? I'm leaving that purely to your speculative thoughts at this point. One way or another, it didn't work out well. He would not heed her voice. Being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get out of here." So, allowing his passion in the moment to overrule anything that was left of common sense, he assaults her, he rapes her. That's the way the text reads, that's the way we have to take it. So at this point, of course, the entire situation changes. As soon as it's over, as soon as any semblance of recognizing what he has done comes back into his head, he realizes, of course, number one, he's committed a capital crime, and number two, that the only way to get out of it is to blame her. And so, rather than owning up, which would have been the manly thing to do, even though he'd done a horrible thing, he says, "It's your fault. You came in here with this plan. You came in here planning to seduce. You get out of here, you bad woman," you see. One commentator said, "So violent passion transforms to violent revulsion," reflecting a theme the world's poetry has often mentioned and showing how close together lie the spring of love and hatred. He wants to paint her as the seducer, himself as the victim, and of course all of that is probably flowing from a bit of self-loathing that had to come flooding in almost immediately following this particular crime. Amnon despised himself and turned the anger of his guilt on his sister. It's not uncommon for psychology to deal with men and women who go through life driven by the curse of conscience. Conrad's Lord Jim, which I'm sure some of you have read, pictures the lifelong torment of a soul who violated his own code. The only therapy for such a broken soul is forgiveness, not the blame game that Amnon, of course, is resorting to here. She now says, "No way. You're trying to get rid of me now? No way. This evil of sending me out is worse than what you just did to me." But he would not listen to her. So he forces her, he blames her, doesn't offer to do anything in consideration of what he's just taken from her. It's monstrous. It's despicable. It is not a good commentary, of course, on his character. It's also a pretty sad commentary on David's, and David's failure to really be the kind of father he should have been to this young man. But then you realize if it did take place in this window time, David's moral authority in the family is shot. And in some ways, what Amnon has just done is not all that dissimilar to what David had done toward Bathsheba not that long ago. And so you have a little bit of a son following in the footsteps of his father. So Absalom, as you probably know, is eventually going to take the life of Amnon, and we might scratch our heads a bit as to whether that was quite the right thing to do, but I don't think anyone would really doubt that Amnon got what he deserved. This was not any point where a great deal of sympathy would rise for him. Well, Amnon called the servant who was attending him and said, "Get this woman out of here and lock the door behind her." Now she had on a robe of many colors, for the king's virgin daughters wore such apparel. And his servant put her out and bolted the door behind her. Then Tamar put ashes on her head, tore her robe of many colors that was on her, laid her hand on her head, and went away weeping bitterly. She is being forced out as if she were the one utterly at fault for this, and at least in the moment, she probably assumes that's the way it's going to be understood. She doesn't have either the maturity or the savvy to understand that she's not quite in as bad a situation as she thinks. She's believing this guy who's the heir to the throne can have it any way he wants it, and she has been utterly devastated beyond words by this. No attempt to conceal her anguish. She goes to the only safe harbor she can think of, her big brother, who's about a year or two younger than Amnon, and she goes to his house, shows up on his doorstep. He puts it together in a heartbeat. Has Amnon, your brother, been with you? Hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this to heart. So Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. When Absalom said to her, "Hold your peace," what's packaged in that is, you don't take any action. You stay here. I'm your big brother. I will own the duty of making sure that the right thing happens. So it's an invitation for her to live under his protection, and a promise is implied in it that he is going to act on her behalf to vindicate her. So she holds her peace based on that assurance that comes from her big brother. Of course, Absalom doesn't take any immediate action either, because he is going to wait, as he properly should, to see what action David will take. He's the king, he's the dad, he's the patriarch, and properly it falls to him to step up and do something about this. So Tamar remains desolate. Absalom waits day by day, and with each passing day, his rage increases, both toward Amnon and toward David, because David is not doing anything except, verse 21, getting mad. When David heard all these things, he was very angry. The Septuagint adds, not in the Hebrew, the translators couldn't resist inserting into the text, but he did not punish Amnon, his son. The crime that Amnon committed under Jewish law was a capital crime. It deserved and could easily have been executed as a capital offense and prosecuted, I should say, and he could have been executed for it. What did he get? He got a tongue lashing. David was mad. And you can imagine when he was in there yelling at his son, you could hear it 3 blocks away, as David was uncorking every conceivable thing he could say about the idiocy and the evil of what his son had done. But of course, David was not in a great position to throw rocks. And so he's not going to do anything more than simply yell at his son, but he doesn't punish his son. One commentator said, "This is the anger of moral impotence." David thought he was in no position to do anything but just get mad. But parental fury, as a substitute for calm discipline, only fuels the flame of bitterness in the children. It's worse than useless. I don't know if you ever had this experience. You were probably much better boys and girls than I ever was. But did you ever have to stay after class and write on the blackboard 500 times? "I will not throw paper airplanes," or whatever. Ever had that experience? If I could just have my way for half an hour or so, I would make about 50 million parents in America write on the blackboard 500 times these words: parental fury as a substitute for calm discipline only fuels the flame of bitterness in the children. It's worse than useless. Parents that scream at their kids without taking any meaningful, sane, calm, cool action with respect to the misdeeds, the inevitable misdeeds of their children, just make it worse. There's a lot of angry adolescents across America. How many of them do you suppose have been treated to this kind of parental discipline? True discipline, he continues, mediates the justice of God and the mercy of God, leading to repentance and reconciliation. The Bible has an ethic for parenting. I know you all know this, but it's the perfect moment to just remind ourselves of it, that parenting is an important business, and God in His wisdom has given us guidelines and warnings. And one of the warnings is don't simply make your kids mad, you see. Paul says, you fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. And so David's failing in the first instance is compounded now, you might say, by a failing in the second instance for not doing what should have been done. What it should have been done, it could have been capital punishment, but not necessarily. But it could have been something pretty severe. It could have been something that would have sent a message, you see. But what is it? It's just David losing control, screaming his head off, and doing nothing meaningful. Well, Absalom, a little cooler, spoke to his brother Amnon neither good nor bad. Poker face. Absalom hated Amnon because he had forced his sister Tamar. But, unlike his father, he hid his rage. So his inscrutable face hid rising, murderous anger. One said the murderous silence of Absalom was in high contrast to David's reaction. David probably said a good deal to Amnon, but did nothing. Absalom said nothing, but did a great deal. David had the right and duty to speak the word of salvation and to perform the act of justice. He did neither. He said too much without doing the right thing. Absalom said nothing and did the wrong thing. Well, months go by, 2 years go by. Absalom never betrays what's in his heart. 2 full years later, Absalom had sheep shearers in Baal Hatzor, which is near Ephraim. So Absalom invited all the king's sons. You probably know that sheep shearing was a time of high festivity. It's like the harvest. It's like when you get all the payoff for all the work you've done through the year. So it's a big celebration. People are expected to come and kind of have a party atmosphere in this time of festivity. Baal Hatzor is a location about 8 miles north of Jerusalem. It was Absalom's private estate. And it's here that he's planning to carry out what David had never been willing to even contemplate. One said the patience of vengeance was a family characteristic. While Joab usually acted swiftly and decisively, David could bide his time, advising Solomon to bring punishment on Shimei for insults years before. That's a story we'll look at later separately. Amnon was a dim-witted fool who acted swiftly to fill his appetites, a little like Esau. Both Amnon and Esau were easy prey for brothers of much greater cunning who played for much higher stakes. You know the story of Esau, and in some ways you see a little bit of it repeated here. Well, Absalom came to the king. Remember, it's a festivity, high celebration. Amnon goes cheerfully enough to the king and says, kindly note, your servant has sheep shearers. Please, come with your servants and go out to join in the party. But the king said to Absalom, no, my son. We're not all going to go. It'd be too much of a burden for you to entertain all of us is the idea. He urged him, Absalom urged him, but he would not go, but he blessed him. Now the force of this is that Absalom is having a big party. He probably knows David won't come, but he wants to extend the invitation because it creates the right impression. David buys it. To say it blessed him actually means he gave him probably a lavish gifts, food and stuff to help out with the celebration, though David is not going to go. So David, off his guard here, he probably thought when this thing first happened that Absalom would do something. That's probably was on his mind. He knew Absalom had that sort of family situation, that you might expect that from him. Nothing happened. Absalom just kind of goes about his merry way. Time passes. David probably began to think, well, I don't know, maybe he got over it. Maybe time heals wounds. David has been ineffective. He expected Absalom to do. Absalom hasn't done anything. It's kind of a swirling, dark, unhappy situation. Well, Absalom says, well, look, Your Majesty, speaking to his father, if you won't come, then at least make sure that Amnon goes with us. And the king said to him, well, why should he go? Why do you want to make sure he's out there? But Absalom urged him, so he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Now again, you would think David would have kind of sensed something was up. Make sure Amnon's there. But I think the way Absalom sold it was, look, I know that Amnon and I have had some, difficulty in our relationship. We've been through a little bit of a rough patch. But I just want to make sure that he knows there's no hard feelings. Come on, let's let bygones be bygones. Come on, let's have all the sons out there. If you're not going to come, king, at least make sure that all the sons are there to help in this big celebration. And apparently, David bought it. He may have had a little suspicion, but he allows himself to be maneuvered by his very bright son, and so Amnon goes. Amnon, I think, is clueless, personally. Absalom made a feast like the king's feast. Then Absalom commanded his servants, watch when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, strike Amnon, kill him. Don't be afraid. I've commanded it myself. You're just following orders. I bear the responsibility here. Be courageous, be valiant. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons rose, each mounted his mule and fled. You know those mules, they can move, so they're getting out of town in a hurry. Now again, it looks like just cold-blooded murder, but colorably, Absalom is acting in a legitimate role in the ancient world, especially in Israel, but other nations had it too, of what's called the Avenger of Blood, in which the nearest of kin had a legal right to go and execute justice against someone who had committed a capital offense against a near family member. The fact that Absalom does this publicly, he doesn't do it secretly, it's not a knife in the back in a dark alley, it's something that he's not trying to hide it at all. It suggests that he's doing this intentionally to carry out his duty to vindicate his sister by means of this execution. So it is kind of an execution-style moment. The sons of David who were there don't necessarily know that. They think maybe this guy's angling to launch a coup at this point, and so they get going, unsure of Absalom's intentions. They thought maybe this is a purge, a play for the throne, but really you have to say Absalom hasn't done anything, at least in the record, to suggest that was his ambition. Well, the people that were ahead of the sons as they're riding back to Jerusalem on their mules are the servants who are just running like mad, trying to get away from there. So they show up first, and they say, Absalom has killed all the king's sons, not one of them is left. Which, of course, is way over the top of what actually happened. But they didn't see the whole thing. They didn't stick around. One commentator says it is a strange quirk that news, especially bad news, when at the rumor stage, will tend to be greatly exaggerated. A wise person learns by experience to withhold judgment until all the facts are in. The right reaction and fruitful action await confirmation. So the King David, thinking that all his sons were dead, that's what he thinks, tore his garments, lay on the ground, and all his servants stood by with their clothes torn. Then Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, the Jonadab, who was the original guy to cook up this little plot in the first place, answered David and said, wait a minute. Not all your sons are dead. Don't let my lord suppose that all your sons have been killed. It's only Amnon who is dead. Jonadab doesn't necessarily know what Absalom had planned, but he's just smart enough to figure it out. For by the command of Absalom, this has been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar. So, therefore, do not let my lord the king take the thing to heart, to think that all the king's sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead. Turns out that he was correct, and Jonadab, of course, had probably known this day was coming. He knew that Absalom was not just letting this go. He probably understood that somehow or other this was inevitable. I think Jonadab probably agreed that Amnon got what he deserved. I think that's probably the way that he viewed it, but that's speculation. Absalom, for his part, fled, having committed this crime, is the way it could be construed, or at least having executed Amnon. He heads north, back home, back to Geshur, where his mother was from, and where he would be cared for, and he could live there, safe harbor in exile, as long as he wanted. The young man who was keeping watch lifted his eyes and looked, and there many people were coming from the road on the hillside. So in other words, all the sons are now beginning to show up. Absalom shows no designs for the throne. It's not that he's doing anything at this point that would suggest that he was out to try to grab the throne. It could very well be that at this point he had no intention of making a play for the throne. It may very well be, and in fact I think the story as it unfolds supports the idea that it was David's later actions that actually began to sort of cause Absalom's own heart to begin considering a play for the throne, because he was so increasingly unhappy with the behavior of his father. So all the sons show up. Jonadab says, look, I told you so. The king's sons are coming, just as I said. And so it was, as soon as he had finished speaking, that the king's sons indeed came. They lifted up their voice and wept. Also the king and all his servants wept very bitterly. David, of course, weeping not simply over the loss of a son, but certainly much more deeply weeping, I suppose, over his own part in it, knowing that in many ways he had created the circumstance where this could happen, and that Amnon was in many ways just following his own example. David had been unable to discipline Amnon at all. There had been no consequences for an egregious crime. And it was because of David's moral paralysis, I think probably was what he was feeling, that caused that to happen. So, as advertised, the sword would not depart from David's house, and now he's lost his second son. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Amminahud, king of Geshur. David mourned for his son every day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And King David longed to go to Absalom, for he had been comforted concerning Amnon because he was dead. We don't know exactly what David wanted from Absalom. Did he just want to restore the relationship? Did he want to bring him to justice? That remains a little bit doubtful, but David's later action suggests he hadn't really resolved it himself, and he was still kind of twisting in the wind in some ways in his relationship. In any event, Joab figured out it is not healthy to have a very popular son, Absalom, who is well loved in the community and is actually, in many people's minds, justified in what he had done to Amnon, which is now common news, well known. He was popular. And Joab realizes there's beginning to be a division in the house. People are beginning to rally a little bit to this Absalom, who's out of town in exile, and yet even in his absence, he's beginning to develop a little bit of popular support. And so Joab figures out a way to engineer the return of Absalom. We're going to look at that next week. By the way, again in this room. Okay, so we're 2 weeks in here. So even after Absalom did return, David has this kind of resentful attitude, refuses to see him. It just makes things go from bad to worse. David had no will to prove his love for Absalom by the redemptive act of disciplined forgiveness. He was rather developing a curious ability to be resigned to a death which was the result of his own ability to act. He was wrong on both counts, saying, I love Absalom but could do nothing about it. I'm resigned to Amnon's death because there's nothing I could do about that. He could have done much about both. It was the paralysis of pride. For David to act would require that he himself admit his sin, his failure, and thus participate in the discipline and forgiveness he himself received. So David's still not at his best. Even though he's dealt with Nathan, even though he's repented, he's written Psalm 51, you still see that there's a lot of things there that are not altogether healthy. All right, wrapping up. 3 people I want to highlight and what we can learn from them here. David teaches us that the actions of leaders inevitably set the bar for those who follow, whether parents, presidents, or pastors. Isn't it true? Whatever the people who are in high visibility do tends to become the bar. Set the bar high, you get one effect. Set it not so high, you get a different effect. David's learning that the hard way. Jonadab teaches us that clever strategies are never a substitute for a calm, steady policy of doing the right thing with integrity. Jonadab was a smart guy, but he was a little too smart. The way he should have responded to Amnon was very different than planning a little sort of tricky situation, you see, that would wind up at least potentially in such a catastrophe. So Jonadab was smart, but not smart enough for the situation here. Amnon teaches us that innocent desire can easily become a tyrant of obsessive lust, a cruel taskmaster bent on destroying its slave. Those things that begin to take over our lives never show up showing their worst face. You know, it's always under the species of the good. Just innocent little things that can become the addictive, destructive things. We all know this. We've all seen it probably in our own lives and others. So we learned some things even from this very unhappy story. And I've been kind of dreading that one because obviously it's not a very pleasant one to tell, but there it is.